Hi, I'm Eduardo Neret with Campus Reform. Thank you for joining us today. Today we are interviewing the president of the Population Research Institute, Mr. Steven Mosher. He's a China expert and has vast knowledge on what the Chinese Communist Party has been trying to do with the United States for the last few years, with the rest of the world, and how they were trying to infiltrate and overtake us, not only on our college campuses, but in terms of our economy, our military, and all of these things. So, Mr. Mosher, thank you for joining us. I want to get to it because, as you know, at Campus Reform, we've covered in particular the ways that China has tried to, buy influence on college campuses. We've seen over the last few months a number of university professors and staffers be arrested for stealing research, for smuggling research out of campuses. So I guess for the audience, why and when did China start doing this? What are they trying to do on college campuses, and is it working?
Well, Eduardo, let me start by telling you a little bit about my history. I am patient zero when it comes to China's influence and interference on college campuses. I was the first American social scientist allowed into China way back in 1979 when we normalized relations there. I was teaching at Berkeley. I was finishing up a PhD at Stanford. And when I came upon human rights violations in China, and I did big time, and I came back and reported them to Stanford University, the Chinese Communist Party put tremendous pressure on Stanford University, a major private university in the United States, to punish me severely. And Stanford did. Stanford fired me. So this interference in our campuses, in our intellectual freedom, goes back a long way. It goes back to the very beginning of our relationship with the People's Republic of China. Just as the tiger can't change its stripes, so the Chinese Communist Party has never once changed its behavior. We find President for life Xi Jinping, I really call him Dictator Xi, saying the same kinds of things that Chairman Mao did 60 and 70 years ago. Word for word, verbatim, we hear things like, China has three magic weapons, Dictator Xi says. The first is the People's Liberation Army, which is not a magic weapon at all, but a real weapon. The second is propaganda, which we find in a major way on our college campuses today through the Confucius Institutes and professors who are soft on China. And the third magic weapon is China's united front tactics, where they go into organizations nominally independent and subvert them and twist them and bend them to their will. So I was a victim of two of the three magic weapons: the propaganda coming from China, which said that I had not been doing research in China at all, but had been spying, of all ridiculous things, and then later on going into Stanford and pressuring them to do China's bidding. So this has been going on for a long time. It's only gotten much, much worse in the last 15 years.
That's fascinating. When you initially went there, did they let you in with open arms, not realizing that you were going to return and report the truth about what you had seen? I mean, talk to me a little bit about how you were able to kind of go in and see firsthand what they were attempting to do.
Well, remember, we had just normalized diplomatic relations with China on the 1st of January in 1979. I was in China by March of 1979, so I was on the ground early. And the reason I was able to go was because there was a scholarly exchange program signed between the United States and China. It has never been an equal exchange program. In that first year, we sent 50 American scholars to China. I was one of them. China sent thousands of researchers, scholars to the United States. So it's never been operated on the principle of equality at all. But the reason I was able to go was because, first of all, the Chinese Communist Party had initially turned down my research, and then President Jimmy Carter made a personal appeal to Deng Xiaoping, China's supreme leader in those days, Deng Xiaoping, saying, we have an American social scientist who wants to go to China. And Deng Xiaoping, China's leader, said, it won't be a problem. So I was able to go and do research for a year in China with the permission of Deng Xiaoping himself. So, Eduardo, no local official dared get in my way. When I went to meetings of the Chinese Communist Party, they weren't happy about it, but no one dared throw me out. When I went to meetings of the local people's militia, and saw them practicing, military drills. They weren't happy that I was there, but they didn't dare throw me out. And when I went with women who had been arrested for the crime of being pregnant without permission, and who were in some cases 7, 8, and 9 months pregnant, very close to giving birth, I went with these women when they were taken to the hospital and given forced abortions. The communist officials were very unhappy that I was there. But again, they didn't throw me out because I had permission to be there from the supreme leader, Deng Xiaoping himself. So it was a very unique situation. It was a situation where I was able to gather a lot of information about a lot of human rights abuses, not just forced abortion and forced sterilization, cases of infanticide, the killing of full-term healthy infants at birth, and other abuses, the mass starvation following the famine of the Great Leap Forward, and on and on. And of course, China began complaining that I hadn't been doing scholarly research at all, but that I had been spying, that I was a spy, and demanding of Stanford, of course, that I be punished, and Stanford went along with it.
Well, and it's ironic that what they accuse you of is exactly what they're doing today on college campuses, and you perhaps got the last real look at what China was doing. It's impossible to go there and to get a clear picture these days. They won't allow it. You mentioned the Confucius Institutes, and that's something we've reported on for a while, and I think a lot of Americans are starting to realize what these institutes are. But another area that I think has popped up in the news cycle recently because of the coronavirus that most people haven't heard of before is the 1,000 Talents program, or the 1,000 Talents plan, in which China, tries to recruit, university professors, staffers, other people in other industries to provide them with information, with intellectual property, with research by hiring them. And of course, that's what we've seen a lot of these professors get arrested and indicted for over the last few months. What is the 1,000 Talents program more deeply than that? Because I think that's maybe a scratch on the surface of what Americans understand about the program. How in-depth is it, and what is China doing to get this talent for the future?
Well, the Chinese Communist Party set up the 1,000 Talents program back in 2010. And it was at the time, it was a public effort to recruit foreign scholars to come to China and share their research, share their knowledge about cutting edge technologies, especially things like artificial intelligence and robotics and genomic research and other areas that are part of the China 2025 plan to dominate the high-tech, high ground of the future. And this isn't a small effort. There have been, as of 2018, with 2 years ago now, I think there were 326 foreign scholars, many of them American, recruited in the 1,000 Talents program. And the problem with the 1,000 Talents program is this. Many of the American researchers, a half dozen who've been arrested since January, when I think the first arrest was made of the head of the chemistry department of Harvard University, Professor Charles Lieber. The problem is that we in the United States at our elite universities and state-run universities fund, using literally billions of dollars, cutting-edge research in every area of high-tech that China's interested in. And to give the example of Professor Charles Lieber, he received $15 million in grants from the National Institutes of Health to research implanting microchips in the brains of laboratory animals, mice and rats. China wanted to get its hands on that research. And so in 2013, they approached Professor Lieber and said, we want you to open up a laboratory exactly the same as the laboratory you have at Harvard, and we'll give you over $1 million to do that. And by the way, we'll pay you $50,000 a month for your contribution to China's scientific advancement. And under the terms of our agreement, you have to train Chinese scholars and students in the technology that you've developed, implanting microchips in the brains of mammals, and also you have to welcome them at your Harvard University lab. So it's the 1,000 Talents program is really a technology transfer program, but it's being carried out in secret. Unfortunately for Professor Lieber, he never told Harvard University that he was stealing the crown jewels of his research and selling it to China for pennies on the dollar. I mean, he may have gotten $1 million or $2 million, but the U.S. taxpayer paid $15 million for his research, which again, he sold to China and didn't report to the NIH, didn't report to Harvard University that he was doing this. So I call this isn't the 1,000 Talents program, Eduardo. This is the 1,000 Traitors program, because the people, the Americans who participate in this program, do not reveal that they're taking their cutting edge research paid for by American taxpayers and selling it to China. If they did, they would be told to stop. But of course, they do it in secret. And now they're one by one being uncovered. There are a couple hundred more out there, I think, that are now being investigated.
Oh, you're absolutely right. It's a betrayal not only of their country, but of the American taxpayer who has paid for this research. And from my understanding, another issue that I think arises from this is that when you see them get indicted or arrested, it's for, not entirely reporting it on their taxes or not reporting it, like you said, to the National Institutes of Health. So is actually accepting a position with China at a Chinese university, is that illegal? Is that a crime? Because I think that's the issue. I think, the U.S. government is able to nab these professors and these university workers on other related crimes to the China funding. But it seems like getting money from China itself to share this research isn't a crime. And that's sort of mind-boggling, because you would think Congress could put a stop to it right now by saying, any relationship regarding university research with the Communist Party of China would be illegal. And that would hopefully deter a lot of it, or at least allow law enforcement agencies to go after it more rigorously. So why isn't it not like that? Why is it not illegal to work with China in that way?
Well, it's not illegal right now. That's why we're doing the same thing to the people in the Thousand Traders program that they did to Al Capone 90 years ago. They got him on tax evasion. So they're getting Professor Charles Lieber and others like him on charges of tax evasion, not reporting this income they received from foreign sources. And they're also getting them for filling out false forms with the NIH grant process, where they say they're not receiving any other money for this research that they're applying to NIH for grant for. But we need to put in place restrictions, legal restrictions on this kind of behavior. I think we ought to be cutting back on the number of Chinese researchers and scholars who are allowed to come to our universities, the number of Chinese students who are allowed to come to our universities, whether it should be a blanket prohibition or whether it should be a prohibition on majoring in science and engineering and the other aspects of high tech that we know there has been rampant thievery in, rampant cyber espionage, rampant hands-on espionage. I'll leave that up to the legislature, but we should be barring these kinds of scholarly exchange programs because they've only worked in one direction. I mean, I was able to get a lot of information out of China, but since I've been in China, social scientists, especially ones like myself who can read, write, and speak Chinese, are not welcome in China. They're happy to have American nuclear physicists or chemical engineers or American biological chemists like Professor Lieber of Harvard come to China and spill their guts. But they're not at all happy to have people come in who find out what life is really like in the world's only high-tech digital dictatorship, where there is now an invisible wall, not a great wall of high tech surrounding the Chinese people, eavesdropping on everything they say, everywhere they go, everything they buy, and all the opinions they hold. It's a frightening situation we see developing in China today.
I couldn't agree more. I have one more question for you, Mr. Mosher. Going forward, when we look at China and compared to other U.S. deemed threats, whether it's by Congress or our intelligence agencies, for example, the Russia threat over the last a few years in the Trump presidency, it seemed all of our lawmakers were up in arms about Russian influence in our democracy, but yet everyone is so quiet about Chinese influence in our democracy, in our science, in our research, in the business world. Why do you think it's taken a global pandemic for some people, just some people, to start opening up their eyes? We still have a lot of people in this country who shill and go out and defend China and defend relationships with China. Why don't you think people are quick to treat China in the same way as we have treated other nations? And then the second part of this question, if you will, paint a picture for us of what the future of the world looks like if we do not address China's rising power economically and militarily.
Well, I think a lot of people in the United States in elite circles have been compromised, and they've been compromised by Chinese money. Wall Street financial firms have made literally billions of dollars off offering IPOs, initial price offerings for Chinese firms, which don't actually, abide by international accounting standards. And American investors have often been bilked out of their money. All Chinese state-owned firms and even the nominally private-owned firms, because there are no real private firms in China, should be delisted from the New York Stock Exchange yesterday. we shouldn't be funding. We've sent $3 trillion in hard currency to China over the last 15 or 20 years. That has propped up the Chinese communist regime. That flow of money has to stop. We have to delist these nominally private companies from the U.S. stock exchange. But a lot of people on Wall Street have gotten rich. And then, of course, there's the media, which wants access to China, wants to have its reporters, its correspondents stationed in Beijing, even though if you're in Beijing, you're constantly being watched by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. You can't go anywhere, talk to anybody without their permission. So you're really a kind of captive journalist who engages in self-censorship. So the media has basically played along with China's censorship. The universities have been compromised by Chinese money. The Department of Education believes now that at least $900 million has been given over the last 6 years to 115 universities and colleges. Harvard is the big winner. It got almost 93 million, but there's been money doled out everywhere. And that money has resulted in China area studies scholars being hired who are panda huggers, who aren't capable of taking a hard look at what China is really like. And, you know, if you look closely at what China is really like today, we see a high-tech digital dictatorship where everyone in China with a cell phone, and that means almost everybody, is required to download a Xi Jinping app on their phone, an app designed to force you every day to study the works of dictator Xi for 20 minutes. And then to make sure you've studied it and absorbed this propaganda, you have to answer questions about what you've just read. So every day, everybody is having to dose themselves with a dose of pro-communist, pro-Xi Jinping propaganda. The phone, of course, that you carry around in your pocket tells the Communist Party everywhere you go, everything you buy. They do a social credit score on you based on your activities, your opinions. And if your social credit score goes up, guess what? You get a low interest rate loan to buy a car or home. You can get a passport. You can get an exit visa. You can travel overseas. If your social credit score goes down, you can't get that low interest rate loan. You can't travel overseas. You can't even fly on a plane inside of China. If you travel, you have to take the lowest class of train travel to get from one city to another. So life becomes very difficult for those who don't think well of the regime and don't speak well of it. That is the world that is taking place in China today, a kind of virtual dictatorship where Big Brother is always watching 24/7, where artificial intelligence parses everything you say and everything you do. Big data crunches it. And if you're behaving in any way the government doesn't approve of, then human intervention comes in. You get the knock on the door and you're told you better clean up your act or you'll be in re-education camp. That's the world in China today. That's the world that China, the Chinese Communist Party, would like to impose on the entire world of tomorrow. We cannot let that happen. We are in, an existential struggle with the Chinese Communist Party to determine what the world of the future will look like. The world under a beneficent Chinese, or rather American predominance has been a world that is increasingly free, increasingly prosperous, and where people have seen the best living standards and the most freedom that we've ever seen in human history. A world under Chinese hegemony would be the opposite. It would be a much darker, much poorer, much less free place. That's not a world that I or my children or my grandchildren want to live in.
And it's not a world I want to live in either. So we got to do something to stop it. I agree with you 100%. Mr. Mosher, thank you so much for joining us. I'd love to do this again if you have some time in the coming weeks as we get more updates, maybe with regards to the coronavirus and maybe as we see more updates on campus. But again, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you, Eduardo.
How's it going? I'm Eduardo Neret with Campus Reform. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to subscribe to get our latest content, click right here. If you're interested in joining our team as a correspondent or an investigator, click there. And if you want to donate to make sure we can create more great content like this, click right here.